Okay, so let's take a look here. And we left off at the discussion of the democracy created in Athens. Now, Athens was the only place this was created. This form of government isn't going to be popular in any of the other city-states anywhere. And it never, this idea of democracy was never going to catch on anywhere else. But so this was kind of a unique moment. One spot in all the world that came up with this idea that the people ought to have more of a say. This was in the 5th century in Athens. Women, of course, as you remember, we're just reviewing here, didn't have any right to participate, which is sad, but nevertheless. And really, it only applied to about 30,000 of the 300,000 people in the city that actually had political rights, that could vote, that could participate in government and all that kind of stuff. So it was a lot more limited than the democracy we have today, of course. But still, it was the first, and it was a step forward. And people who are aristocrats or people who are wealthy with money, ship owners, that kind of thing, or anybody that served in the military could participate as full voting citizens or become part of the Council of 500, which we'll talk about again here in a minute. And that Council of 500 made the laws for the year. And if you wanted to be on that council, you just put your name into a jar, and they divided all of Athens up into 10 different groups, right? They had like 3 regions. They had the coastal region where the shipping and merchant was. They had the city itself. And then they had all the area around was the agricultural little communities. Well, they were kind of at odds with each other. They had different ideas of what should happen. So Solomon quite smartly said, okay, I'm going to divide you up this way. I'm going to take a bunch from here, a bunch from here, a bunch from here, and put you all in one tribe. We're going to have 10 of these tribes, and we're going to, just like cohorts, right? We're just going to mix you up so that you have some from the coast, some from the city, some from the countryside. So you'll discuss each other's needs before you send your participants, and it was kind of a representative thing, to the Council of 500. And each of these tribes, these groups, would have to get together and pick 50 people. Now, how did you get to be one of the 50 people? Well, you drew your name out of a jar. So everybody put their name in a jar. You had to put your name in one of those vases. And then they drew out 50 every year, and you served. So the odds were that in your lifetime, if you were a citizen, you'd be 3 times on the Council of 500, which is a lot like being in our Senate and our House, right? Same sort of concept. Now, any person could argue in front of the Council of 500, no matter who you were, what your station in life was, whatever, you could go make your case. And we do that today. Congress has meetings and they let people testify and talk. And so we learned a lot from the Greeks here. And but it wasn't a perfect democracy. No democracy ever is, really. But it was the first, and it was really important. Now, Pericles is going to become very important to the story in the next lecture. And Pericles, he ruled Athens between 495 and 429. Yes, they still had somebody who was going to be their leader, right? Even though it was a democracy. And they elected him. They picked him to be their leader. And he said this, and this is important because what I'm showing you is a primary source document. Basically, this is Pericles talking in his own words. And he was very persuasive. He was from the aristocratic class, but he understood that it was a democracy and he had to involve a lot of people. And what he says here is really, really important. So he said this: the administration is in the hands of the many and not of the few. Now, when we use the word administration, we mean the government. So for example, President Trump's administration, President Obama's administration. Mr. Trump runs the executive branch, and that's his administration. So in this case, Pericles has his administration, but it's ruled by the people, right? Not just the few. So the administration is in the hands of the many and not of the few. But while the law secures equal justice to all alike in their private disputes, now this is something that they did in Athens, which was really important. They set up a new legal system that didn't discriminate based upon who you were. For example, if you were to be a rich nobleman, you could have all the money in the world, but when it came to court, it was equal with the poorest person. So they had a system of justice that was fair for everybody, not just for the wealthy and powerful. So that was another big accomplishment that we often don't talk about with Athens, but it was a big deal. The administration is in the hands of the many and not of the few, but while the law secures equal justice to all alike in their private disputes, the claim of excellence is also recognized. The claim of excellence. Now you're thinking right now, I am thinking right now, oh, so in other words, you're more important, you're for a nobleman? And that's not what he meant. Here's what he said. And when a citizen in any way distinguished, he is preferred to the public service, not as a matter of privilege, but as the reward of merit. And what he's talking about here is in Athens, we had a thing called the meritocracy. We have that in America too. This concept's really powerful. It basically says it doesn't matter who your parents were or how much money they had. They earned it, they did their thing, but that doesn't apply to you. You can be the poorest person, but if you're the smartest person in the room, then you're the one that people should be listening to. So you rise up not based upon who your connections are, family or wealth or power, but your own ability. So it was your own ability that matters most. And that's really what you're doing here at UCAS. When you look at UCAS and what it's all about, you're basically putting yourself into a situation where you're competing against the most academically elite group of students in the Valley. The truth of the matter is, this is the most academically high achieving school in all of Utah County. Some of you even come from outside the county. You deliberately put yourself in a situation where you have to work hard and be competitive because you're going to take the next step and you're going to start college, right? While you're still a sophomore in high school. Because you're trying to prove yourself. You're showing your merit, your ability, your talent. We're not going to hold you back and keep you in high school when you can do college level work. This class right here was a college level class. So we're teaching it to you, kind of still, and we're still doing a high school version of it because simply you're not in college yet. But this class, I could turn the switch just like that and turn it into a college level 3 quarter credit class tomorrow. Because that's what we used to teach this as a college course. And so that's the rigor that we expect. We expect you to be the best because you are. You wouldn't be here if you didn't think that you had some ability and you wanted to achieve. And that's what meritocracy is all about. You achieve based on your own hard work and talent, and mainly hard work. And that's meritocracy. So when you graduate with your degree from UCAS and UVU, you go out and you can do great things because you've got a jump start on your college education. It's kind of a cool thing. But Pericles was talking about the same sort of meritocracy that you're experiencing right now. And we know in Athens, of course, they had the experiments in democracy. We also know that it was the wealthy and the military service that mattered still. It was just not all men were created equal. That would have been one of their attitudes totally. And we know the Council of 500, how important that was. I explained that a minute ago. Now, this whole idea, though, this experiment in Athens becomes the key to understanding a later event in world history, the French Revolution. Because the French are going to, more than anybody else, develop the Enlightenment thought that leads us to the type of government that we have in the United States today. So Athens kind of lays some seeds, plants some seeds that grow later into the American Revolution, the French Revolution, which is pretty important. Also, too, we've changed the meaning of tyrant. Instead of being a capable leader that the people support that could either be good or bad, now, of course, the word tyrant means evil, unscrupulous dictator like an Adolf Hitler, for example. Right? All right, now let's talk about the antithesis. The antithesis of Athens. In other words, its polar opposite. Now, we have polar opposites in history all the time. For example, the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, right? That was a polar opposite. Those are two different societies, two different ways of looking at things. All the way through history, you see this. You see the Persians versus the Assyrians. The Assyrians were like mean and evil, and the Persians are like these nice guys that take over, right? I mean, they're enlightened, they're smart, they're allowed people freedoms. They expanded freedoms. They eliminated slavery. They had literature. The Persians were a great culture. The Assyrians were not. Everybody was glad to see them gone. Glad somebody strong enough came by to take them out. And that's a little bit like the Spartans. The Spartans, if you look at all of Greece, right? Now we tell great stories of the Spartans, and I'm going to tell you a story about them, and you're going to go, oh, that's the coolest thing. But you got to understand who these Spartans were. They were not a group of people you wanted to live under. You did not want them to rule over you. They were, what's another word for it? They were just weird. How did they get to be weird? Okay, well, here's the thing. They are locked in the middle of this, looks like an island. It's not. It's connected to the land by the Peloponnesus, right? This little stretch of land. So armies can march through like this. But the deal is they were up in these mountain areas right here. And like every Greek city state at that time, their population began to grow. All these other city states that were close to the coast, what they would do was simply, put people on ships and say, hey, go find another colony someplace. We'll do trade. It's like England sending ships to Jamestown colony in Virginia. You're still part of the British Empire, but, we're going to settle a bunch of people there. I mean, the British put people on ships to send them to Georgia and to Australia, prison ships. They took all the prisoners and they sent them to, somewhere else. And then when they finished their sentences, they could go out and start their lives over again, but somewhere else, right? But these people were scattering around the Greek diaspora, but not the Spartans. The Spartans weren't an ocean-going people. So as a result, right, the only thing they could do was attack the people next to them, which were down here in Mycenae. Now, excuse me, did I say that right? Yeah, Mycenae. They were a city-state. They were doing really well. And then all of a sudden, the Spartans invade. Now, the Spartans didn't occupy that land. Instead, what they did was they turned the people that lived there into what they called helots or captives, which is another way to say slaves. And basically, they just took over and said, all right, this farm belongs to this specific Spartan. Every Spartan was given a farm or two. And the family then had to support that Spartan, who then they went back home. I mean, they went back up into the hills, right? The Spartans did. But every year, you had to give 50% of everything you made to your Spartan. So helots actually means captives, right? People we've captured who are our slaves, right? Now, look, the Mycenaeans outnumbered the Spartans 10-1. So they were going, why are we going to put up with this? So they rebelled and rebelled again. So the Spartans created a mindset of a military mentality, and it was pretty insidious. They basically quit having normal families and this kind of thing, and took their population and put them into military barracks and trained all the time for war. So when the Mycenaeans got out of hand again or rebelled, they could go and destroy them. So they were living constantly with this idea of warfare, and that's all they did. And they would have two kings now elected. One king would stay in Sparta when there was a war, and the other king would lead the war and go out. And if that king was killed, they had a backup king. So they always had a king, right, in case something happened on the battlefield. And then they also had this council of elders. When you got to be 65, 28 of them, of these old guys, they literally called them the old guys, were chosen to be this council of elders. And they had some weird power. If any baby was born in Sparta, any baby that was born, they would go inspect the baby. And if the baby had any birth defects, if it looked weak, if it didn't look like it was strong, they took the baby and took it out of the woods to perish. Because they only wanted strong children. Men and women didn't live together. They didn't form families. You couldn't even marry in Sparta until you were 35, and then it was discouraged. Here's what happened if you were a young person. At age 0, they would inspect you and see if you were strong enough. And if you were, then you got to stay with your mom until you were 7. At 7, you were rounded up and pushed into a barracks to live with the other boys your age. Girls, by the way, too, were sent to training all the time. And when you went to this school, it wasn't a school to read and write and do any of that. It was all about physical education and learning to use weapons and fighting in war. Now, to toughen them up, they only gave them one blanket, kind of a poncho kind of thing. They slept in it. They lived in it. If it was cold, that's all they got. They slept on the floor in their barracks. Once a year, they'd be allowed to go down to the river and cut reeds to make a bed for themselves, just one time a year, and that's it. They went barefoot. So no matter what the conditions were, if there was snow on the ground or rough ground, whatever, they went barefoot because they had to be tough. And they pitted them against each other in athletic competitions and little mock battles and things. And the ones that succeeded were cheered, and those that failed again and again and again were ridiculed and mocked. They had a very high suicide rate. And this was just no way to live. Now, as you got older, you get to 18, 19 years old, you're about ready to join the military, then you had a final exam. And the final exam was like insidiously awful. Basically, certain of the Spartans were constantly keeping an eye on the Mycenaean slaves, the Helots. Once a year, they actually declared war on the Helots, and any Spartan that wanted to go kill a Mycenaean could legally. They legally declared war so that, they could just go and kill any Helot they wanted. But they had these spies that would keep an eye on these Helots and the Mycenaeans, and they would find those that were strong or leaders or whatever, and then they would have a student, before they became in the regular military, travel over the mountains and go kill that person with their bare hands as a graduation. These are evil people. These are warped people. These are people that have no sense of family and all that kind of stuff. They live for one thing, but they did produce the greatest soldier, man to man, that existed probably in the ancient world at this time. And so this warped culture couldn't be more opposite than Athens. Now you see kind of why the Athenians were a little upset when a Spartan army comes in and helps Leonidas, not Leonidas, what was his name? Isagoras, take over. They weren't going to stand for it because they weren't going to be treated like the Helots of Mycenae. Well, all right then. This barracks mentality, they didn't build forts, they didn't build walls, they didn't need them. Their wall were their soldiers. And there's a carving actually from the day of what a Spartan warrior might have looked like. Now, the opposite of the Spartans were, of course, the Athenians, but another opposite were the Persians. So we're going to go revisit the Persians here for a second and add a little bit more information about them. The Persians were very enlightened people, very educated, very smart, had established the first and greatest empire known to man, where they linked together all four of the ancient civilizations, China by trade, and then actually occupied part of the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia and that too, and Egypt. Anyway, the founder of this empire was Cyrus, as you remember. Of course, this is a review slide. And the interesting story told about him by Herodotus. Now, who's Herodotus that we should care? Well, Herodotus is a Greek, and he's an historian. He's one of the first legitimate historians. So he's kind of a special guy, right? I mean, is Herodotus. Now, a lot of times Herodotus would, well, listen, he's trying to make the Greeks look good and the Persians look bad. But by the same token, right, the Greeks were fascinated with the Persians because they were such a different culture. And of course, they're going to do some battles together and all that. But that didn't mean they didn't want to know everything they could about the Persians and found them very interesting. And Herodotus wrote this story about the story that's told about Cyrus when he was a young kid. Herodotus said, at his birth, Cyrus the Great, his grandfather had a dream where his grandson, Cyrus, would overthrow him. He ordered the child killed by his steward named Harpagus. Unable to do so, the steward says, I'm not going to do that. He gave the child to the king's herdsman named Mithridates, who actually raised then Cyrus as his own child. So Cyrus was going to become a sheep herder for the rest of his life. But then at age 10, the plot was discovered because people noticed this Cyrus guy, he just acted too noble. He couldn't be a mere son of a sheep herder. He had to be a prince. Do you see how the arrogance is around nobility? That nobility are special. And even when they're dumped into a family of sheep herders, they're still special. Now that's prejudice and arrogance and all that kind of stuff. We won't go into all that. But Harpagus was punished for this. But Cyrus was returned to his parents, and Cambyses the first, I guess the grandfather died by this time or whatever, but he was raised then in the palace from that point on. But that's an interesting story that a Greek historian tells about the Persian leader, the first Persian leader, Cyrus the Great. Now look at the expanse of his empire. And one of the areas he had to conquer, of course, was Babylonia here. So Babylon was captured. They went to war against them and took them. And then they went to war against Assyria. And this is really where they won the local people over. When they knocked out Assyria, people were going, here's to you. We're on your side. We're with you. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they're going to conquer all the way to the Hellespont. Now you see I keep pointing in this area right here, those little two narrow strips of land. This is where Istanbul is going to be, Constantinople. Here's that narrowest strip of land or water between the Asian continent and Europe. Conquered all the way to that, which meant they conquered a bunch of Greek city-states along this coast called the Ionian coast. So they're already taking a big chunk of Greece. Now, he rules for 29 years, which is one of the reasons he was so successful. His son Cambyses II takes over, conquers all of Egypt. Before his next descendant's done, Darius, they're pushing into the northern part of Greece and all the way to China. I mean, they're the ones that start the silk trade. So it's pretty amazing. Now, the tomb of Cyrus, there's a description on it. They're actually still there all these centuries later, millennia, really. It says on his tombstone, again, primary source, right? This is primary source. He obviously wrote this himself and said, put this on my tomb. Oh man, wherever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who won the Persians their empire. Do not therefore grudge me this little earth that covers my body. Yeah, I know you're going to come as a tourist, but don't begrudge me having this little pyramid. It's an interesting take. Anyway, the Persian leaders were unique. They were above it all. They were like pharaohs. They were treated like pharaohs. Not so much gods, but they were mystical, and you couldn't approach them unless you were on your knees. And if your shadow actually went across any portion of the emperor, that you could be killed. So you'd lay flat on the ground. And they had veils around them. So you couldn't approach them as if they were, some godlike figure. So a very mystical kind of thing. And that's not, of course, the way we do it in the United States, right? I mean, we are a president, pretty much everybody's saying something good or bad about the president all the time, freedom of speech and all that. That would not be something you would do in Persia. Persia, there was like this overawe and reverence, like, well, maybe the Egyptians would have for the pharaoh. But now here's the deal. What Cyrus did well, why he was able to rule such a large expanse, two reasons. One, he broke it into smaller places called satraps, which is equivalent of maybe a state in the United States. Say Cyrus the Great's empire was the United States. He'd have 50 satraps or 50 states. And over it, he'd have a governor. And these were called satrapies. All right, well, he also granted religious freedom. And one of the groups he granted religious freedom to, I'm going to go right here, religious tolerance and freedom, and he also abolishes slavery, right, would be a group called the Hebrews. And I think I have another slide here. Nope, don't. My apologies. Okay, so we'll just go with this. But when they attack Babylon, right here, Cyrus and his armies couldn't get through those walls. That city was so well defended and everything else. And they had this river, a part of the river was diverted to bring water through this city. And Babylon was such a beautiful city. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon is considered one of the 7 great wonders of the ancient world. So what they did was, why don't we dam up the water, divert the water, so this river drops to nothing, and they walked right underneath the city on the riverbed and took it over. And when they got there and took the city, Babylon's going, what just happened? Okay, all right, we're on your side now. But they went around and said, who are you? Oh, we're a bunch of slaves. Where are you from? Oh, we're from Palestine. What are you? We're Jewish. We're Hebrews. We have one God, and his name's Yahweh and all that. And he said, well, cool. Do you want to go back home? Sure. And it was Cyrus that allowed them to return back to Palestine. So in the Bible, he comes off as a big hero. And he allows them to rebuild their temple. And he said, now listen, if you're going to be in our empire, practice your religion the way you want, live your life the way you want, keep your own culture, all that's good. But pay your taxes and in time of war, provide troops to support our war effort. And that's really all you got to do to be a Persian, right? And so they did. They went back. Okay, I'm going to skip that quote there. And skip that one and let's move ahead. I promised you too a picture last time of the Medes and the Persians. Remember, the Medes were the first city they took over, but the Medes had actually ruled over them for a time. So tables turned, but they kind of were treated a little bit like co-equals in a way. And you see it in some of their sculpture. Here is a Persian, notice the style of dress, versus the Mede, who dresses differently, and a Persian. So Persian, Mede, Persian, all on this mural here. Also, too, they managed to domesticate the dromedary, which means camels. So they were using camels as well as horses in their military, and it was kind of a cool thing. Well, what happens now is the Persians take the old Hittite Empire and move all the way to the Hellespont and take over some of these Greek city-states along the coast here. One group in Ionia didn't like that. Greeks being Greeks, they just valued their independence above anything else, and they decided to attack the head city in the area, the satrap city, be like Salt Lake City, right, is the capital city of Utah. They marched in to this city called Sardis, and they burned it to the ground. Well, the Persians couldn't put up with that. So they pulled their army together and they said, look, this is a bad example. If we have people in weird places burning down capital cities, then that's going to set a bad example everywhere in the empire, in Egypt and India, everywhere else. So we've got to go punish that activity, which they did. And they attacked Ionia and literally destroyed it and took it apart stone by stone, and it was gone. And then they asked the question, who helped them? Was there anybody that gave help and comfort to their enemy? And the Athenians had. The Athenians were larger. They had a good navy. They gave some support. It wasn't much, but they gave some support to this. And so the king of Persia, right, the emperor, had a slave whisper in his ear every day as a reminder, remember the Athenians. And he put together a huge fleet. They sailed off this coast and were coming up this coastline around toward Greece, around toward Athens. And a big storm came. And this storm came down this area right here and just literally destroyed the fleet. So the first attempt, the first Persian fleet was destroyed in a storm in 492. But this is a wealthy big empire. They just rebuilt the fleet and they come again 2 years later. By this time, the leader is named Darius. Now, Darius is going to underestimate the Athenians here because what's going to happen is he's going to send about 30,000 troops, 25, 30,000. And the Athenians only have 10,000 troops, right? Their military isn't all that big. And they are going to face off at a place called Marathon. Now, before we do Marathon, I want you to look at this picture here. Basically, the Greeks had developed a style of warfare that was unique. They had this big bronze shield, which was very tough, wood shield covered in bronze, called the hoplon. And they would use it almost like a battering ram, right, in battle. And they covered their whole front, when they had the shield up. And then they had this long spear, which is about 9 feet long, 8, 9 feet. And this spear then would be used to jab with. If all of that fell apart and at last ditch resort, they had a sword, a short sword, not very long, that they could fight with, if things went wrong. Now, to protect their shins, right, they had bronze plates and protect their shins from being cut. And also the helmet was bronze to protect their head. It's very expensive equipment, no doubt about it. But it would prove superior to what the Persians had. The Persians had wicker, or, they made of reeds and stuff. And it was effective when you're fighting up in the hills and you're moving fast and you had this light cavalry and that you were using, and the infantry was mopping up. And they had, spears and everything too, but it's just not the same. So what's going to happen here is at the Battle of Marathon is the Persians are going to land on the coast, some 25, 30,000 of them, at a place called Marathon. Yep, this is where the marathon race gets its name from. Because what happens is there's a guy by the name of Pheidippides. Now, the Athenians were really worried that they were going to lose, that they were going to be destroyed, that their city was going to be burned to the ground, and they were going to become part of the Persian Empire. So they sent a runner, Pheidippides, 140 miles down to Sparta and asked Sparta, let's see if I can find a map here of Sparta really fast. Got to go back too far. My apologies. There we go. So here's Marathon. He runs all the way down the Peloponnesus, down into Sparta, and asks for help. And the Spartans check with the oracles. Yeah, they were doing divinations and things. And they said, no, sorry, you're on your own. And they didn't send anybody. In fact, nobody sent anybody. Athens was on its own, maybe because everybody was too afraid. But at any rate, what happens is after a few weeks of landing the troops and whatever, the battle starts to take place. The phalanx of the Greeks was stretched thin. They were only like 3 deep, but they had to cover a valley from one end to the other. And the reason is if somebody came into the side, their formation was shield to shield to shield to shield with the spears coming through. As long as they were moving forward, they were safe. And if you had a couple of guys behind you, if you fell, they would take your place, right? And it's called the phalanx. But if you get anybody behind you or to the side, you were toast. And these guys had cavalry. So when they decided to fight this battle, the Greeks saw an advantage. There was a big hill here and a big hill here. So the cavalry was neutralized. So it was going to be infantry against infantry. Now they thought they might have a chance. And so what they did was they lined up, and then one morning, after a couple of weeks of just yelling and screaming at each other, they advance. And as they're coming in a long line, all together in this phalanx, shoulder to shoulder, spears ready to go, the Persians line up. This is great. We're going to have this big battle. We outnumber them 3-1. Let's go to it. And they started to form their lines and started to move forward too. Now, just at the time they about smash into each other and have what we call a pulse, right? Where you hit shield to shield and you stab for a bit and you come back and then you launch your attack. Before that happens, the center of the Greek line starts to back up, like they're afraid, like they're going to get beaten, like they don't have a chance. And the center pulls back in a retreat. The Persians go, we got them. So they start chasing after those Greeks, but the sides folded in like a box. And now it was the Persians that didn't have anybody defending their side. And the slaughter was insane. Literally, the Persians were pulling in on themselves, running to each other, and all these spears coming, and then this line that was retreating advanced again, and they just destroyed them. The Persians began to run. They jumped into the ocean, and there's stories of the Greeks pulling out their little sword, chasing them all the way to the boats and cutting their hands off and their arms off as they tried to climb into the boat. It was one of the most decisive victories in Western history. And then Phidippides, once again, gets on his running shoes and runs the 26.2 miles from Marathon to Athens and yells Nike, which means victory, and drops dead right then out of probably dehydration. That is the marathon. The marathon was born that day. And I've run marathons, I've qualified for Boston, whatever, and we relive Phidippides' great achievement in sandals. He ran in sandals, and it's an amazing story of heroism and courage. But the Athenians had won against all odds. Okay, now what happens though is the Persians aren't finished. Now they're really ticked. And remember, they have this vast empire. So about 10 years goes by. By this time, Darius is gone, Xerxes' son. He's the one that they're saying in his ear, remember the Athenians, remember the Athenians. Guess what? They sent about somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million troops and over 1,000 ships to go and burn Athens to the ground. That was their goal. We don't know how many there were. The Greeks tell us there were 1 million. Herodotus says there were 1 million of them. And he says this, he says, there were so many Persians that they drank rivers dry as they passed by. All right, well, it was a big force. Most people think it's somewhere around 300,000, which was amazing. I mean, feeding all those people. That's why they had to have all the ships to provide food and whatever. Now, back at the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians got the wrong lesson. They thought if we double down on our phalanx, on our fighters, on our wall of warriors, we're going to be able to defeat these guys, right? But there was one guy that was watching this whole thing. He was one of the generals, and he was a guy that came from a farm family. He was not from nobility, and his name was Themistocles. Themistocles went and argued with the assembly and said, you know what, we really need a navy. And they're like, we don't need a navy, we need a stronger army, because if they come back, we're going to go after them with the army. And he says, well, no, I get that, because he's lying to them now. Themistocles looks at the Council 500 and says, what we need is a 100 triremes, brand new type of warship, where you have 3 layers of oarsmen and you're ramming into your enemy, because there's this island over here of pirates and they're stealing our trade. So let's go destroy those pirates. So let's build 100 ships and destroy those pirates. He didn't care about the pirates. He was preparing for the next war. And over the next 10 years, they built 100 of these triremes, and they were ready when it happened. And he became the admiral of this new fleet that he had asked the taxpayers of Athens to build. by lying to them. But it worked. So when the next battle took place, the Persians bring hundreds of ships. Now, they also bring this large land force. And what happens is they come around the coastline, right? There's this narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, and it's called Thermopylae. And this time, all these other Greek city-states join in because they realize that the Persians come this time with so many people, they're not leaving. And the Spartans sent 300 soldiers as well. They went to the oracle of Delphi, and the oracle said, but a king must die so a nation might live, right? So one of the two kings, Leonidas, volunteered, takes 300, and they become the front line on this narrow pass. Now, even though they only had 300, they had other Greeks behind them, some 10,000. So 300 in the front, they were the tip end of the spear, and then these other, roughly 10,000. But across the way, there were 100 to 300,000 Persians. But when you're in a narrow pass, you can only send 1,000 people at a time, say. And so what happened on day one is the Persians sent their forces and the Spartans just destroyed them. Killed maybe 10,000 that day. That night, everybody's pulling their dead away. Xerxes says, hide the bodies because I don't want my troops to see that. And the next day he sent in his best infantry called the Immortals. I think I have a picture of the Immortals. Here's the Immortals right here. And the reason they were called Immortals, they covered their heads, actually covered their faces too, with this screen. And they marched silently. The Spartans were yelling and screaming all sorts of insults. That was part of their battle plan. They were yelling and screaming all the time. These Immortals come silent, 10,000 of them. The reason they were called the Immortals, if anyone died, there was another person that was trained to take his place. So it was always 10,000. This one group of Immortals was bigger than the entire Greek force. And they were the elite. And when they got up there and they smashed shields together, these wicker shields, which were great in the highlands when you're chasing people around and going fast, but when you're in the middle of a pass facing a hoplite army with these bronze shields, and men who knew how to use them, boom, they'd use these as punching bags. Then they'd have the spears. It was a slaughter. The Immortals were just destroyed. That's day two. Day three is different though. Day three, what we have is a situation where spies, there were Greeks that were actually had joined the Persian side. And they said, look, you can go around these guys. There's a trail. And you can take an army and march over this trail and come around behind them. And if you can get behind them, it's over. It's game over, right? Meanwhile, Themistocles has a fleet trying to keep the same thing from happening. There's an island, right? And then here's Thermopylae, and there's this channel of water. And he's got to keep the fleet, the Persian fleet, from coming around behind and landing troops behind him. And he's doing that. He's stopping them. Amazing couple of battles to make sure that, they didn't land troops by sea. But now they're going behind this mountain and coming around. Now there were supposed to be some groups, a group of Greeks guarding the pass, but they had fled because they thought their little town was in trouble. Whatever excuse you have. And the Greeks found out about it. They knew they were coming. They knew they were toast. So the Spartans agreed to stay with 1,000 other Greeks from the city-state of Thesbos, so about 1,300 of them. We will stop their advance as long as we can and give the other 8,000 or so of you a chance to flee so you can live to fight another day. And when the battle took place, it was one of the dynamic battles of all time. Every single Spartan was killed. All the Thesbians were killed too. But they held that pass long enough for everyone else to retreat, to live to fight another day. And that's the story of the 300 Spartans and King Leonidas. So I guess their training worked. But you should also know that their society would die because they didn't have regular, normal family kinds of relationships and all that kind of stuff. So their population, not now, not in the next 20 or 30 years, but down the road will dwindle to the point where Sparta became insignificant because they simply didn't have enough people. But that's another story for another day. Right now, they're at full power. All right, so here's the final battle of Thermopylae. Here's the pass I'm telling you about. And and so they were all killed. Leonidas was killed by an arrow that came and hit him in the neck. And that was that. All right, well, the Persians march on Athens and burn it to the ground. So their goal was achieved. Took them 3 tries, but there you go. But Themistocles wasn't done. He basically, all the people in Athens had fled. There were only a few people guarding the temple that were stayed behind, and they were killed, right? It's burned to the ground. And all of the Athenians now are either along this coast or on this island of Salamis, fleeing for their lives. They've got to run somewhere. They don't know where they are going to go. There's no home anymore. Persians are now taking it. So Themistocles sends a message to Xerxes, the Persian leader, and he said, I'll tell you what, you've beaten us. We've got this fleet. There's other Greek fleets here from other city-states. You send your fleet in. We'll pretend we're still fighting with them. And then when you come in, we're going to turn our ships and we're going to attack them, and you're going to destroy all the Greek opposition, and you win, and we're going to help you because you've obviously beaten us, right? Well, Xerxes bought the lie, and that's what it was. And so he sends his fleet in this narrow channel. This is an island. And between that, there's this kind of rocky channel. The tide and the currents are really rocky in there. The winds can come up. But on this side, it's a little bit more sheltered. So all of a sudden, all these ships come in. Now remember, you're rowing them, and you're going to get up to like 20 knots, 25 knots. So when you hit another ship, you ram it, right? Because it's got a front end, it's a ram. Then you ram it, and you can pull back and watch the ship sink, or you can then have your guys kind of climb over and fight a battle, you know, at sea, as if it were a land battle. But the idea is to ram your enemy. So you want to get as much speed as possible. So all of a sudden, 500 or so ships of the Phoenicians, excuse me, I'm sorry, of the Persians, flood into this channel. And they're all running parallel like this when the Athenians and the other Greeks hit them from the side. And you don't want to be on the side. And before these Persian ships can turn, other Persian ships who are also moving fast are smashing into them. So they're just piling into themselves, just like a train wreck, right? Or on the freeway, there's a wreck and all these cars pile into the wreckage, right? And that's what's happening here. And then these guys, the Greeks, are ramming these ships because they're still on their side, pulling back, and they sink the whole fleet. Xerxes, the leader, was actually camped out on a hill looking down, watching the whole thing. And when he saw that, he realized he had to go, because without the fleet, there was no way to supply their troops or to keep their troops in Greece. So he gets on a ship with what he had left and just goes home. What we don't know is they're never coming back again. There were some troops that were left, that there were no places for them to go. And another Spartan force attacked them at a place called Plataea and defeated them pretty handily and pushed the Persians completely out of the European side of the Hellespont. And it was Themistocles that wins this battle with his navy at a place called Salamis. And this is the most important moment in Western history to this point, because had he not done that, you would probably be speaking some sort of Persian-like language. You would be studying Persian poets and Persian stuff. You might be worshiping a god called Zoroaster. And the whole history of Western Europe is over, because there is no Greece. And Rome would get overrun quickly because they weren't much. And all of Western Europe, there was nothing to stop the Persians from going all the way to what we now call England and taking all of that and adding it to their empire. So this was really the most important battle in the history of Western civilization, the Battle of Salamis at Sea, led by Themistocles. In Doctor Who fandom, I don't know if any of you are Doctor Who's, but they have these moments that are called fixed moments in time. If things don't happen at this time period in this way, all of history has changed. A lot of things can happen in day-to-day life and whatever that won't change history, but this changed history. So that's the battles between the Persians and the Athenians and the Spartans, and there's going to be more to that. Here is Xerxes watching his fleet be destroyed. It just was this compression of ships that they couldn't maneuver or whatever. And then the great Spartan victory at Plataea ended it. And that was the third Persian War. So we had 1 attempt, 2 attempts, 3 attempts. And so these were called together the Persian Wars. All right, well, that's kind of enough for today. And we didn't get nearly as far as I wanted to, but we'll have another lecture on Greece before we give you a study guide, and that'll be good, because hopefully you'll have some time. You'll be able to catch up in all your classes and take some time on Tuesday night and watch the debate with your family if you can. All right. Any questions?